Hi guys, Peter Bowman here. So, should you rent or should you buy in 2023? Well, if there was ever a year to ask that question, this is the year. We've got rental prices going through the roof and we've got interest rates that are absolutely screaming upwards. So yes, very good question. Let's have a look at it. We're going to have a look at some live examples. We're going to look at some of the general pros and cons of rental versus ownership. And then at the end, I'm going to share with you my view on it and how I've used my decisions around this space to help supercharge my results over the last 8 years. So let's start with the costs. What are the costs of renting versus the cost of property ownership? Okay, well, with the rent, it's relatively simple. However, there are some things that people tend to forget. Now, the thing that most people don't take into consideration when they're looking at their rental costs is inflation. Because when you buy a property and then you have your mortgage repayments, those mortgage repayments, depending how you set it up, admittedly, will tend to stay relatively steady over the longer term. In fact, they may even decline over the longer term depending on how things are structured and what happens in the economy. On the other hand, with rent, it's more or less guaranteed that it's always going to go up, probably in line with inflation, which obviously at the moment is pretty significant. But even if we just work on the 3%, so if we're looking at a mortgage this year and we look at the price of the cost of that mortgage, so we might be able to fix that interest rate for 5 years. So that's going to stay consistent. However, on the other side, the rental price is almost certainly going to increase by at least about 3% each year. So what you're paying this year will be very different to what you're going to be paying next year and the year after. Very much so in the current market, because 3% increase over 12 months at the moment would be a blessing. So then we look at the ownership side of things. Ownership, the costs do get a bit more complicated. You've obviously got the interest you've got to pay the bank. You have ownership costs, so council rates, taxes, insurance, and without a doubt, those things are definitely going to add up to more than the costs you have when you're renting a property. And then there is the other side of things too, where when you're renting, you don't have to worry about repairs and maintenance. The responsibility of that sits with the landlord. However, for any of us that have rented, we know that landlords can be pretty sloppy with that. So that can also be a negative for renting, where you don't have control over the repairs and maintenance, and you can't even put a hook in the wall when you want to. I once lived in a property that was 5 bedroom, big place, and it had one picture hook on the wall in the entire property. One. We asked if we could put another one. We even offered to paint the wall and fill in the gaps when we left, and they still wouldn't let us do it. And that same landlord also took 3 or 4 months to fix anything. So that was awesome. So there is the other side of property ownership versus renting as well. It's more of an emotional thing. There is definitely something that property ownership does for the soul when you own your own home. And then on the other side with rental, you've got a lot more flexibility. So you can change property quite easily based on the needs that you have in your life at the time. I know for my wife and I, there was a time when we were changing property about every 12 months because our needs were changing, our family was growing, where we wanted to live changed. So, that would have been a very expensive thing to do if we were owning properties. So let's dive into a real example. I've chosen a couple of properties here because they are what would be considered pretty average in the Australian market. Now the numbers may seem staggering to those in the UK or in the US markets, but in general, Australian real estate is really expensive. However, don't get lost in the numbers. Just have a look at the overall percentages and the overall theme, and you're still going to get the same message and same results. So the examples I've chosen here are both 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car houses, which are very standard in the Australian market. We have the opportunity to rent one for $580 per week. Yes, in Australia, we talk in weeks, and yes, $580 per week, not per month. So $580 per week, or we can buy a very similar property for $619,000. Now, if we break the cost of the home ownership down into a weekly as well, the mortgage repayments on that property, if we got a 90% lend, so 10% deposit, 90% debt for the property purchase, the repayments would be $834. Now, that is significantly higher than $580. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, there's my decision. I'm out, I'm renting because that's just way too expensive. Wait, because we need to look at the big picture. See, the thing is, when you're renting, you see none of that money ever again. That is just purely a cost of your living. The $580 is gone. On the other hand, when you're owning real estate, part of that repayment is going to paying off the principal. Yes, a very large portion in the early years of a mortgage is all going to the interest. However, in this situation here, if we've got a 30-year loan, about $10,000 per year early on is getting paid off from the principal, which broken down into a weekly amount is roughly $200 per week. So $834 is your weekly mortgage repayment, but $200 of that is getting added to your equity. So you're not losing that $200. You're effectively getting forced to save that $200 per week. So really we need to look at $634 versus $580. Still a $54 difference, but that's a very different picture to $834 versus $580. However, we can't get around the fact that yes, it is cheaper to rent. So in the very short term, you may be better off renting, especially if you think you're going to be moving every 12 months like we were for a period. But with real estate, we definitely need to look at this with a longer term lens because nothing about real estate is short term. Even if you're renting and you chose to rent for the rest of your life, you're still renting for the rest of your life. Different locations, sure, but it's still something you need a roof over your head for the rest of your life. And keep in mind that $580 per week is the rent this year. What about next year when you go to renew after a 12-month lease period? Well, with the rental increases we're seeing at the moment, it's pretty much guaranteed that that $580 per week will end up being more than that mortgage repayment when we take off that $200 equity component. So we do need to look at the bigger picture when it comes to these things. Because the thing is, if you fix your interest rate, your mortgage repayment is going to remain relatively steady over the longer period, potentially may even decrease over the longer period. And one of the examples I always like to think about is when you look at what people paid for their real estate 20 years ago, and in the context of where we live here, we go, oh, if we look 20 years ago, people might have paid $50,000 for a property in Burpengary where we're looking now. Imagine what the mortgage repayments were when they bought that at $50,000. To us now, that seems minuscule. Well, if that person bought that property for $50,000 or bought a property in Burpengary for $50,000 20 years ago, then they had a mortgage for let's say $45,000. If they had a 30-year mortgage term, they might still be paying it off. But how small would those mortgage repayments be? And what we're looking at there is exactly that, the cost of inflation. Now that dollar amount seems very small. So the same thing happens for anyone that buys real estate now over a 10-year period, over a 20-year period. What seems to us like a lot of money now is likely going to seem like a very small amount of money in 10, 20 years time once inflation has played its part. Okay, so let's have a look at how all this plays over a slightly longer time frame. We're going to look at 5 years and 7 years. Why those years? Because 5 years is the average time that a person spends in a rental property before they move on, and 7 years is the average, at least in Australia, the average period of property ownership before they sell up and move on to another property. So I'm going to use an online calculator and I'll share the link in the comments below so you can try this out for yourself and have a play with them. They are really useful and this website does have a whole range of really useful calculators. So let's input the information. So we've got $580 a week in rent. I'm going to leave the electricity, gas and water as zero on both the property ownership and the rental to keep it as even as possible. I am going to assume $80,000 worth of savings. Now the reason I'm doing that is $80,000 is roughly the amount of cash that a person would need to purchase the $619,000 property if they're doing a 90% lend. I'm also going to assume $800 per month in savings. The reason I'm choosing that amount is because when we looked at the mortgage, we talked about there is a $200 per week forced savings. So that keeps things relatively even because we're going to assume that this renter isn't just spending that saving. We're going to assume that they either leave it in a savings account, which currently, as I've shown here, you can get about 4%, or we will also look at if you were to invest that in, say, an ETF or something like that that mirrors the general market. So we'll look at the S&P 500, which long-term averages 8 to 10%. So we'll look at that as a possibility as well. Because one of the things that often doesn't get considered here is the opportunity cost of the deposit that you put down for the property. Because if you weren't investing that into that property, you could be investing it somewhere else. Can you get a better return on that money? We'll have a look at that. So now we look at the buying numbers. Okay, so we've input $619,000 as the purchase price, a 90% lend, a 90% loan, or a 90-10 LVR, loan to value ratio, would be a $557,000 mortgage. I'm going to say it's over a 30-year loan period. Depending where you are in the world, you might have different rules there as the loan periods you're allowed to do, and a 6% interest rate, which at the moment is relatively standard. I'm also going to assume that real estate is on average going up 5% per annum. Of course, it doesn't do it every single year, but long-term average is actually considerably higher than that. You would have heard, and historically, real estate prices do double every 10 years, sometimes better. If we're going with 5% growth per year, that has them doubling only every 15 to 16 years. So we're sort of being conservative here for the property owner. Okay, so who comes out ahead here? Now, before we go ahead, pop in the comments who you think is going to be ahead and by how much. Just take a stab, just a guess. Throw it in the comments now before we go any further. No cheating. Okay, so after 5 years, Our renter has a net worth of $150,000. Now that is assuming that they have taken those funds, that savings, the $80,000 and the $200 per week savings, and invested it into a savings account at 4% per annum. This does not take into consideration tax, by the way. Well, our property owner has a net worth of $235,000, considerably ahead. Now, you might ask why. Why is there such a difference if we've got an interest rate in our savings account at 4% and real estate is only going up 5%? Why such a difference? And the answer there is leverage. Because with your deposit, you are controlling a property that started out being worth $619,000. Whereas when you were investing at $80,000, you're only investing $80,000. So that's a very big difference in how much that interest rate or that return is amplifying. And that is one of the big differences. So people talk about opportunity cost. What else could you do with the deposit? Well, let's look at that for a second. If you're getting a 5% return on a $600,000 property, that's $30,000 per year that you're making in equity. Now, if your deposit, we'll keep it simple for numbers here, if your deposit was $60,000, that's a 50% return on your $60,000. If you know how to get better than a 50% return on your money, I think you're doing just fine. So pretty compelling for property ownership, but let's have a look if we get that higher return. So let's put in an 8% return on the savings for the renter. So this is assuming that they are investing it in something that mirrors the general performance of the share market. Okay, that's taken their performance, their net worth after 5 years to $177,000. Still quite a long way behind the $235,000 for the property owner. All right, let's have a look at 7 years. So after 7 years, and I've left the returns for the renter at 8% on those savings. After 7 years, the renter is at $229,000 and the property owner is at $317,000. So the evidence is pretty clear here over the longer term who is going to end up better off financially. Now, I did promise with you that I'd share my overview on this at the end and probably throw a little bit of a cat amongst the pigeons. So for those of you that know me and have been following me for some time, you probably know where this is going. However, for those that don't, my answer is probably going to surprise you a little bit. So do I believe you should own real estate? Well, absolutely, yes, I do. Why? Because that's how I've grown my wealth. That's how I've achieved financial freedom. And it is, in my opinion, one of the safest ways to build wealth over the longer term. That being said, I don't believe your first property purchase should be your own home. I think that is a mistake. Why do I think that's a mistake? Because 89% of people never buy another piece of real estate. Because once you buy your property, your first home, you enter a comfort zone. All of a sudden it becomes about the holidays, about the holiday home, about the caravan, about whatever it might be. But the statistics don't lie. 89% of people never buy an investment property. So what do I suggest? Well, I suggest renting initially where you want to live in as most cost-effective way possible and buying real estate where it is good to invest. Positive cash flow real estate. Now, that may not be easy to buy off the shelf, but you can create it. And I am going to be covering that in other videos. So for those of you that don't think it's possible, it absolutely is possible. How do I know it's possible? Because I've created it myself. So rent where you want to live as cost effectively as possible, especially in your early years. Make the sacrifice in your 20s. Honestly, who cares where you live in your 20s? As long as you've got somewhere to put your head, you're happy. Buy where it makes sense for investment purposes. Then once the equity has grown up, you buy another property and another property and another property, and you start building your asset column, which is the key to wealth. Build your asset column, not your column of all of the rubbish that's going down in value and costing you money. Simply buying a few investment properties in your 20s will basically set you up for life. So imagine if you actually continue that trend. And I do cover that off in other videos. So if you want to know that in more detail, have a look at the video about how to make $1 million in real estate. So that may surprise some of you. I do agree. Yes, real estate ownership is a great idea. I don't agree with buying your own home straight up. Build your asset column first, make wise investment decisions. And I stress that because here's the thing, buying a home is an emotional choice. And emotions don't belong anywhere near our investment decisions, which is why it is often one of the worst choices people make. Is it a sacrifice? Absolutely. You can do it. We made the decision to do it, and I can tell you 7-8 years later, we are absolutely glad we did it because the freedom it has created for us is irreplaceable and priceless. So if you've got any questions, throw them in the comments. If you disagree, throw them in the comments. I do love a good debate. If you have any things that you'd like me to go down into more detail in, because I have skipped over at a pretty high level here, certainly throw that in the comments as well. If you like it, if you got value out of it, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want to see more of this. Hit the notification button if you want to know when we put out more content. And until we speak next, invest safely.